Hello, everyone. First of all, I think this is probably one of the coolest events that I've ever spoken at. So, really happy to see the engagement that's happening. Well, let's get to the point. Let's get to business. So, the talk is from patchwork to Picasso, refactoring 80 plus Angular projects. Actually, it's twice the amount. And what actually went wrong? So, can you imagine coordinating across 80 plus projects? And if you do, you already know that it requires immense planning. It requires a lot of thinking, a lot of brainstorming. If you have those kind of projects and that number of projects, you know that even one tiny small change can have a ripple effect across multiple projects. So if one thing goes wrong, it's kaboom. And to me, it's actually trying to change a light bulb when you're actually riding a roller coaster. So you can imagine that you also need to ship it, but then also need to make sure that what you're trying to do is actually done. Well, for the next almost half an hour, that's what we are going to talk about. But before that, a bit of an introduction. So Kisu automatically said what was done, but I can just mention that this is the Angular cookbook that we are talking about. And if you want to see that in real life, this is right here. And the fun fact is that I always have that in my shelf or just on my desk because it's such an amazing book, not just because I wrote it, but the content it contains is just like a cheat sheet. So if I just need to know anything about Angular or majority of the topics, I can just open and then get done with that. Well, let's talk about what in the actual schematics we are talking about today. And there's a hint about what we are going to talk about. But we're essentially going to talk about how it saved me hundreds of hours, at least 100 hours, working on 80 plus. And as I said, it's twice that, so 160 plus projects for my latest Angular cookbook, which we released just recently after Angular 17 came out. And now we're upgrading to Angular 18. So let's talk about the problem. The first edition of the book was published about 2.5 years ago, and it contained 80 recipes, which actually means we had 80 Angular projects. And the cookbook is designed in a way that you start with an starting state of an application. So you start with an application, then you follow a particular recipe with a bunch of steps, and then you end up with a final state of the application. And the code repository for this, for the readers, contains both the project for the start and the final state. Hence, I'm saying it's twice the amount, 80 plus projects. And when you imagine updating all the recipes of those projects, it somewhat looks like this. It's going to be very slow. And there's a specific reason for that. The reason is essentially the release frequency of Angular. And it becomes really challenging not only for the startups and enterprises for updating Angular, even though I find Angular's update process or the guidance or the schematics pretty smooth. But since Angular has a release frequency of a major release every 6 months, for someone like me who is an author and has 80 individual Angular projects, it's really hard. Even if I go with the automatic migration for all those projects, it's going to take me a lot of time. And I think if I do this every 6 months, I'm probably going to go crazy. So what is the solution that I came up with? In a nutshell, NX is what I came up with. And I'm really glad that something like this exists inside the community. And it's so amazing, not only by the people who have actually built it, but the entire community who's supporting this and elevating this. So if I want to give you the too long didn't read sort of version of it is, essentially we converted this 80 plus projects into actually just 2 workspaces, which means that if I now want to update the content for my book for all the readers, instead of going for 160 projects or 80 projects, I just need to go and update 2 of them, which is amazing because I can do it in just 1 day at max if I find a lot of issues in the process. So this is how the architecture looks like. We are having one single mono repository, and in that mono repository, I have the start folder and the final folder. As I mentioned, all of the recipes of the Angular cookbook have a starting state. You follow the recipe and then you get to the final state, but it's obviously good for the readers to have both of them so they can double check. And if you look at the architecture of the folder structure, every particular folder or workspace, so let's call start and final a workspace, has a folder called the chapter number. So since the book has 14 chapters, we have 14 different folders for them. And each folder has inside a particular recipe or one particular section, you can say. This actually came with a challenge. And the challenge is, if I wanted to create a new application while building the application, and I'm not talking about the readers at the moment, I'm just talking about myself as an author, as someone who's creating these recipes and authoring the book. And I know I have to work with 80 plus projects. If I needed to create a new application, this is what I would do. I would go into the start within the NX Mono repository. I would say, hey, NX, generate an Angular application for me. And then I'm going to give this the folder name and then the recipe name. And the folder name and the recipe name, because I want it to end up within this structure. I want the folder name to be there and then inside that. So we can segregate and it's very easy for the readers to follow. But the problem with that is that if I run this particular command, the name of the application that is generated within the NX workspace contains the folder name, then a dash, and then the recipe name. Now, this is pretty natural, and this is pretty natural with both NX and Angular if you are trying to do something similar. If you try to give it a path that contains slashes, the schematics behind the scenes convert that into different folders, and as a path, they treat them as a path. But the reality is that, do I really need my readers to remember the entire name whenever they are trying to serve an application? I mean, it is probably okay, but I think it is too much to ask from them to remember both the chapter name and the recipe name every time they're trying to serve a particular application. And for me, as someone who's an advocate for great user experience as well as developer experience, I ask myself, can we do better? And when thinking about it constantly, I thought about what are the possibilities. The first possibility was, can we exclude the chapter name from the project name? And if my readers only could work with the project name, that would be awesome. Or can we rename the project after it has been created? So there are two possible options for me. Now, what I went with was super interesting. I looked into this thing called NX plugin, and you might already be using a lot of NX plugin. Even the NX generators are sort of NX plugins as well. So what I did was I ended up creating an NX plugin for myself that can host a bunch of tools that I would like to work with when I'm authoring this book, when I'm working with these 80 plus projects. So I created an NX plugin first to rename the application after it has been created. So I chose the second option. That really means that I have now two counterparts for this plugin. The first thing is NX generators, and the second one is NX executors. And we're going to talk about both of them. The first part, the generator, essentially generates the app for me. So if I'm working on a new project for my book, I'm going to say, hey, just create an app. And my code, my plugin, should first run the generator to create an Angular application. But as it is doing that, it needs to prepare for the executor to run as well. So while this is generating, this does something like this. My generator code adds a particular script to the NX.json of the particular project that we are creating. So it takes that particular configuration and then it adds this rename thingy on top of it. Now, when you look at that, this rename is the executor and it requires two parameters. Because I wanted to rename my project and I want to extract out the chapter name from the existing name, I provide two options, chapter and app, and my code can easily strip out the chapter name and just leave the app name within that. So finally, what ends up happening is that the project that I'm creating, its project JSON, gets this particular script with my particular executor. And this is what is going to execute later on to rename the project. Now let's talk about the executor itself. The part of the generator is done. It created the project, updated the project JSON with my executor. And now it's time for the executor to run and do something. What it essentially does is that it goes inside, gets the project JSON, and then it basically renames this and removes the chapter name from it. So I'm not going to go through the whole code, but I think you get the idea. The idea is to just rename the app. And when you run a project in NX, it essentially looks at the project JSON. It builds a graph based on that. And whenever you run something like NX serve my app 1, my app 2, it looks at the project JSON. And that's why we are renaming everything in the project JSON itself. Now, what I ended up doing was I made it possible for myself to just run this command npm run create, giving it a chapter name or chapter number, giving this the project name, and then giving this a title. And I'm going to talk about why the title is important. So whenever I would run a command, it would run a bash script that would first generate this, and then it would behind the scenes run the executor as well. So let's dissect this into multiple things. First of all, this npm run create went into my whole repositories, my GitHub repositories, package.json. Then this first argument, or what we call positional arguments, becomes the chapter number. The second one is the app name, and then we have a title. And behind the scenes, I've stripped this down, but this is the bash script that runs. When I run this particular command from package.json, it runs a bash script, and it essentially looks into some variables that I've just provided, the chapter number, the project name, and then the title. And then it starts running my plugin. So as you can see here, I'm not running nx generate, a narwhal, or nx angular project. I'm saying nx generate my plugins recipe. And when I do this, I have the possibility to control this and execute the executors as well. And once we are done with this generation, then I run my particular executor. So I say, hey, whatever app you have generated right now, go inside and run the rename one. And when it does this, it essentially goes inside the package.json and it looks at this particular thing right here. So it essentially runs the rename. And with that, it's essentially done. So this is the final project structure that I wanted to achieve. We would have a start folder within my whole repository, a start one, a final one. And start and final both would have apps. And inside apps, we have the chapter number and then each recipe, as you can see right here. And then we have chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter 4, and so on and so forth. So this is the structure that I wanted. All of this magic, essentially, to be able to do just this from my GitHub repository. And as they say, you can spend 5 days of automating something that should be done in 5 minutes. No, I'm just kidding, of course. So all of this was to be able to just do this. So my readers can just go and say npm run serve and the app name. And the reality is that the whole book has 80 plus recipes, about 96 actually, since I counted. And each recipe is unique. Each topic, each project is talking about something completely different. So there is no duplicate in that. So I can have just the name in this command and it would run the right project for me. If I wanted to start both my apps, the start one and the final one, and I would just run the same command with both as a positional argument and would spin up for my readers, both of them, so they can compare how the start and the final looks like. And we're going to see at the end how they look like anyways. Now this came with another problem. Since you can imagine I'm working on a book that contains more than 80 projects, I think I want every app to look the same. They should all have some consistent UX. They should all have some sort of header and basically the same UI. So to avoid any sort of inconsistent styles and layout across the multiple recipes, this is what I came up with. A wireframe that looks like this. So we should have the Angular logo. We should have the title of the application and then an information button that the reader can go and see more information about the book and give a review maybe. And this content that we see right here is the dynamic content. So the same header in all recipes should be there, but the content can change, of course. Now, what can we do with this one? Since I'm running my own library to just generate the application, I can also use something called nx generator. And that is something that I use within my library or within my plugin. So what I do here is a combination of both. I create another library in my plugin. I call it ngcbui. And I do this to contain my global styles. Because we are talking about UI and UX consistency, that contains two things. One, the HTML layout, and second, the CSS. For the particular CSS, I create a UI library, and I know I'm going to use more things inside this library later on. But essentially, this ng cookbook recipe is my plugin, and the ngCBI UI is my UI library. Now, what happens is that this plugin that I've created uses a generator when I ask it to generate a particular application, and that generator uses a template. Since I want my HTML to be consistent everywhere, I want my app's template to be consistent as well. So what then happens is that I end up with this index HTML template. And you can see right here that we have this templating happen where we have this title variable. This is exactly why when I was running the command npm run create 01 and then the project name and then the title, when I run to create a project, that name of the application comes directly here and gets rendered when it is being created. And then also it comes with prefix and some other things as well. But I want you to look at the header component. Since I wanted my app to contain a consistent UX, the app components template contains a header up top, which contains the Angular logo, which contains the title that you can see right here, and then the info button, as I mentioned. And then when this application is created, this content here, or the main element here, is empty. So I could just continue working on the actual content, and I didn't have to copy paste the header, all the time. And then in my app component template, I would also use this. But let's skip that for now. But what about the styles? Since I wanted the styles to be consistent throughout the application, for example, for the header, any sort of spacing, the colors, I actually created a globals.scss file in my UI library. And I essentially then made sure that this CSS, when I create an application, that CSS is involved in all of the projects being created. Because usually what happens if you use Material UI or Bootstrap, you need to go into your project JSON or in your Angular JSON, and you need to import the third-party library CSS file. But since I'm creating my own library here, I want this CSS file or SCSS file to be included automatically in the created project. So essentially, my generator takes care of this as well. What I essentially do when I create this particular package, I first export this by package.json. And then when I go here, when I'm using this particular library, I basically configured this to use the glob to export this. Then in my generator, I added one more command. So not only my generator now adds the executor, the renaming executor that we talked about earlier, but it also now adds this CSS file or globals SCSS file from my library inside the created project. So every new project that I'm going to create is going to contain the global CSS file, which means that all I need to do if I wanted to change anything is just go to my library again, rebuild it, and then it would be automatically included from the node modules. So notice that I'm not copying the file, I'm referencing the built file. And my library, when we compile it, when we build the library, it basically spits out this particular CSS file. And that made it much, much easier. Now the final output looks something like this. So we had a header, we had the logo, we had the title, we had the info button, and we had the content. And since this content is centered, actually all of the projects have a centered content because of my global styles. Yay! But then something happened, and I'm actually a bit worried when I talk about this. Angular changed their logo, and this was one of the biggest things that happened around Angular 17. And my book was released or was about to be released just before that happened. And this essentially left me with 80 plus Angular projects in both of the workspaces, which have a hard-coded logo within the project. So you can imagine, since I used a template to generate my projects, when the projects were generated, they had this image, they had the title, and everything was there automatically. And then this was me, because what I wanted to avoid was this exact thing. I don't have to, or I don't want to update all my projects, go manually inside, and then change that. But now I have a situation where I have to update the logo in all my projects. And the issue is I could probably do it by, finding in the whole projects using regex, but I don't think it's really fun. So the target was to go from this in my template that I use for generating to something like this, that when I generate a new application, it should use a component called header maybe. And that component can then have the reusable logic. And if I needed to update anything in the future, I would just go and in my library, change the component, compile it, and automatically all my applications, since you're using the library, they would get the latest update. So there's no hard-coded HTML in the template. But the problem with this particular situation, even though if I was able to do it, was too late. I already had created so many projects which had the hard-coded logo. The templates are used only when you're creating new projects. So if I change the template, it would work for the new ones, but what about the existing ones, tens of projects that I've already created? So as I said, I already had the created applications. I couldn't use the generator in this situation. So what did I do? What is the solution? The first part of it was obviously to creating a header component. If I have a reusable header component in my library, I can use that within all of my projects. And if I need to update anything, I can do that as well. So the first thing was to creating a header component in my library. It's called the Angular Cookbook UI library. And then the second part was using something called NX migrations. Now, some of you who use NX already know about NX migrations, because whenever there's a new version of React or Angular or other dependencies that NX uses behind the scenes, NX automatically has itself some migrations that it runs when you install or when you update your NX NX workspace. When you do something like NX migrate latest, it runs some migrations. So I thought, can I write my own migration to replace all the projects and replace the header in all of those projects? Which means that I would have to run NX migrations in both places, start and final. So what I did was I wrote an NX migration that would replace the toolbars in all the projects that I've created already. So it would go inside each one and replace this with the header. I'm going to quickly show you what the migration script looks like. So this is the source code of the migration. So it essentially goes into all the projects, checks if it is an application, then it tries to get the HTML file, TypeScript file, and app.module.ts, because some of my projects used the standalone applications that Angular introduced or made stable in 17, and some of them actually use the older versions, which is the module-based applications. So I took care of both of them, and I replaced the toolbar with the new component that we just talked about. So we created the ngCPIU header, and then we ensured that that is going to be done. And when I look at it, I see that this is not showing my whole screen. So I'm going to quickly do this again. Let's see. There we go. And I think we need to bring this to the stage. If someone can help me with that. Thank you. Awesome. So as I was showing you my script, so this is the script that I wrote. And essentially, this goes inside each project and takes care of both the standalone applications and the module-based applications. And then it just replaces the toolbar with the new component that we have talked about. It also goes inside the module file and the standalone component file and imports the header as well. So feel free to look into this file. But essentially, that was the migration that I came up with. And it actually worked very well. Now, what happened in this case is when you write a migration, you can specify in your migrations JSON from which version of your plugin should this migration be applied. And I basically give this a version of 0.0.2. So whenever my start workspace and my final workspace would update their package of my plugin, it would automatically run this particular migration. And that's what it did. It actually ran the migration and everything was super nice. So after running the migrations, I could replace all the headers. And I'm going to quickly show you how they look like. So if you see this whole sort of migration, you'll see that the only files that I have is some of the spec files that I wrote while I was writing this migration. But as you can see here in this particular case, I'm going to zoom in a bit. You can see that the whole toolbar was replaced by the ngCBI header component. And this was not done for one file. It was done for everyone. So you can see automatically just by running one command, I was able to replace the components or the toolbars with the actual component, importing the component as well within the standalone applications and within the module-based application. So this was really, really fun, and I was really happy. And the imposter syndrome was gone as well. But this came with a particular challenge, to be honest. And that was when I'm talking about my styles or CSS styles, in the global CSS, I had CSS styles, not Tailwind styles. But my application also uses Tailwind CSS. And if I talk about my library uses Tailwind CSS. But when you're running your application, the application has to implement Tailwind CSS. But when it goes and tries to render the components from a library, the library has no compiled Tailwind styles. What I'm trying to say is that my application Tailwind CSS is compiled. My library component, Tailwind CSS, is not compiled. And that is a bummer for me. So since my header component was moved from a template from the application to the library, I had to somehow make the Tailwind CSS work for my library as well, where the header component now is. And then basically, this is what I did. I said that my library would also have the setup Tailwind done for NX. And this essentially added the Tailwind config.js just like this when I ran this command, and also created the Tailwind config in my library, which means that now when I'm building this library, the styles are also compiled in that case for my components, which is super nice. And this is the final result. Let me show you how this looks like. This is just one of the cool recipes that I have for my Angular cookbook. In this one, you learn how to implement drag and drop in an Angular application using the Angular CDK. So I could open this folder. I could try to migrate this into either of these folders, or I could reorder this just like this. But if I try to move this, for example, into this folder, you can see the count being updated automatically, and I have the new files here as well. So this is the final state of the particular situation. And before I go to the summary, I also want to show you what I ended up doing in the end. Once we have everything done, I wrote some scripts. Obviously, just like a good developer, I also implemented CI/CD. So once we build this or push this to GitHub, it contains both my starting state and also my end state for all the particular recipes that we have here. For example, if I try to go and say routing or route animations in Angular, you can see that we basically start with this situation where you can go from one page to another, but you end up after route animations, you end up with something like this. So you have a cool animation going on and you have a recipe about that one. So all my projects can be seen just like this, and I can demo them as well. And that's pretty much it. If I summarize what we did today or what we discussed today is how we moved from having 80 plus projects to just 2, which means that now that Angular 18 has been released just recently, I think it's going to take me just a day to upgrade all the projects at once. This is super nice. We also discussed how we can use NX generators to scaffold projects. If you have an enterprise and you want to have consistent styles throughout all your projects that you create, or use the same libraries, have a same setup, you can use NX generators. We also discussed NX executors. So once you have your project generated, you can essentially run executors to do more manipulation within your workspace. So you can change stuff, you can change files, rename files, and whatnot. And we also discussed how to use global styles in multiple applications using NX generators. So we basically added the sort of export in the project JSON using the generators. And we also discussed how to compile Tailwind CSS style in a particular library that we have created. So having said that, thank you so much for having me. I think this was a really nice event. And if you want to check out the Angular Cookbook, just go to ng-cookbook.com, or just try to say Angular Cookbook second edition and you'll find it pretty easily. I think people are really, really liking it. And I would love to get feedback, obviously, on, yeah, how you feel about this. So thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Mohammed. That was very speedy and technical talk. It's very nice. I'm very sorry that you need to change the logo. I can understand the pain. That's quite unfortunate.
That was above my guess.
We have a few questions. So the expected one, how does NX compare to PNPM? What's the difference?
That's a really good question. So PNPM allows you to download the packages sort of, in a parallel manner. It can be used for workspaces as well, but what NX comes with is a lot of tools. For example, if you do some changes within one project in your mono repository, you can actually change, or you can actually check that what is the affected result on the other projects. You can also put module boundaries as well. For example, you can have a layered structure where you can have applications, you can have UI libraries, and then you can have utility libraries as well. And you can configure this in a way with NX and also Sheriff as well, to say that the apps can use utils, but the utils cannot go and pick anything from the applications. So just to avoid cyclic dependencies or a lot of architecture concerns. So I think NX has much more there in terms of just setting up everything. And PNPM is, I think, very raw. So if you want complete control of what you're doing, I think you can go with PNPM.
Perfect. That goes into the second question. How customizable do you find NX for specific needs, and what areas require the most customization?
That's a really good question. I think the possibility of running or having my own particular package was really good to be able to create generators and run executors. What I found the most disturbing, or where I struggled the most, was lack of documentation or examples of actually working with generators and executors. Those who are doing this in their own repositories doing it really, really well, but it's not common knowledge to the developers. I think that's where I struggled quite a lot. And I think where I also sort of found this a bit lacking was compared to bash scripts. So for example, a lot of things I could not do in NX, and I had to create my own bash scripts to those things. So I think that's where it lacked a bit of customization.
Example of,
I think one of the things was when I was generating, or when I was running a particular command from my CLI, and I wanted to customize what goes into then the NX pipeline, there was no middle step, or there was no there's no layer on that particular part.
Oh, that's quite unfortunate. At the same time, do you think that the NX docs can be improved, because maybe having a given specific way of doing things might be difficult to write in a single place without just showing a GitHub repo? Like, do you think you could improve the docs somehow?
That's a really good question. I think I would love to contribute, definitely. They are updating that as well, but I think the documentation right now has really specific information that is too technical. And that's where I also have a bit of like, I give them some leniency because they are not supposed to create full-fledged tutorials. They are supposed to give the documentation for the API. I
Yeah.
think it's probably not part of the documentation, but if they can link to good documentation from the community, I think that's going to be awesome. I can
Fair.
probably help with that.
I had my own question in this. How does it compare to Lerna?
That's a good question. I have not used Lerna, but I think that's
Okay.
also pretty raw. I don't think it has a lot of tooling out of the box. So it's just,
Okay.
for example, I could just use npm workspaces and Lerna
Yeah.
and pnpm. I think it's quite the same.
Okay. Any downsides?
Any downside? One of the downsides is that if there is a new Angular version, I need to wait for NX to upgrade all the packages before I can try to use it. Because usually I'm like, okay, and Angular 18 is out. I need to try it right now in my projects, but I can't do it. I have to wait like a week or two before NX does it.
I mean, if
So
it's just a week, that's nice. Yeah.
exactly.
And,
Yeah.
We even had a speaker recommending to us that you should be one version behind the latest, so that way it's safer and yeah. So it's not that much of a drawback. But that's
I think that
that's
is
the only
also
thing
the
you do?
enterprise mindset
Okay.
as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
here we go.
Yeah.
Okay. An audience question. How do you update community libraries with NX? NX migration seems to require them to be migrated one by one.
Oh, that's a good question. If you need to do it yourself, because I assume that you're talking about other libraries that you are using already in NX,
Yeah.
I think you would have to try it out by doing it manually one by one. I don't think there's a good way of doing it. It's going to be a trial and error in this particular case.
Yeah, you can't automate everything that easily. I mean, with Bash, you could still maybe do something, but yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's pretty much all. Or we're out of good questions. But thanks very much for coming, Mohammed. And I wish you an amazing evening. It's quite late, maybe, at your place.
Yes,
But,
it is.
yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for
see
having
very
me.
soon.